I'm extremely pleased to be joined by Rami Khouri. Rami Khouri is a distinguished public policy fellow at the American University of Beirut, a non-resident senior fellow at the Arab Center in Washington, D.C., a columnist for Al Jazeera Online, and lived in Beirut for 17 years, where for part of that time he was the editor of the newspaper The Daily Star. And so, although it has been a little bit crowded off America's pages by the various craziness happening and elections in various different countries, I really wanted to talk to him about Israel and Lebanon, Israel and Hezbollah, and the prospect of a conflict there, which seems enormously frightening. As always, folks should please put questions in the chat, which I will convey. But I wanted to start with a really kind of childlike question, because I think even people who tend to follow Israel and Palestine oftentimes really don't know very much about Hezbollah. It's a word that's out there as this kind of frightening organization that comes into the news sometimes. But maybe, Rami, you could just start by talking about what is the history and roots of Hezbollah? Where does it come from? What is its belief system? And why is it in this conflict with Israel?
Well, thank you first for having me, and thanks to everybody for tuning in. And I look forward to the questions and comments. So Hezbollah, like Hamas, actually, started as a kind of social services NGO. Yeah, they provided food, childcare, and they were a social services group in the south of Lebanon. They were not a military group to begin with. But in the late 70s and early 80s, because the Palestine Liberation Organization and other Palestinian groups were in South Lebanon, and they were engaging militarily in very small-scale stuff with the Israelis kept attacking them in Lebanon, and they'd bomb the airport in Beirut. And so the Lebanese government was not able to protect Lebanon for various reasons, mainly because the Western powers that supplied its weapons didn't want it to be a threat to Israel. And therefore, after some years, the people of the south of Lebanon, who are mostly Shiites, not totally, but mostly, and Hezbollah is a Shiite-based organization, but it serves everybody in Lebanon. They got fed up with being attacked and having to leave their homes. And so slowly, Hezbollah came to being by 3 or 4 smaller groups in the south of Lebanon mostly, coming together to form Hezbollah, which means the party of God. So that's kind of interesting because both elements in its name, it's a party, it's a political resistance party. I call it the most successful political party in the history of the modern Arab world. I'm prepared to be corrected on that, but I'm also prepared to defend it. There's never been a non-governmental group as powerful and as impactful as Hezbollah in the last century in the Arab region. But nobody has had their impact. And they're based on God, they're based on Islamist principles, but they're not trying to create an Islamic state like ISIS or Qaeda or other people. They are aware that Lebanon has always been a pluralistic place with different religious groups and ethnic groups, with historically a Christian majority, but that's changed now. The Muslims are bigger than the Christians. So they can't impose an Islamic state, and that's not really what they want. They just want, like Hamas and others, they want people to adhere to Islamic values, to address their concerns and needs and rights. And most of those are locally anchored: discrimination, poverty, poor services, corruption in the state, all these local. And then, of course, the Arab-Israeli conflict comes on top of all that. And the trajectory of Hezbollah was created in the early 80s in the south to mainly protect the south. And they did that pretty well. They created various guerrilla groups, and others were working with them. There were some Palestinian groups and other Shiite groups, communist groups, but they were the dominant ones. And then they gradually absorbed all the fighters in the south, most of them. And Iran helped them a lot. And this was a critical turning point for them after the Iranian Revolution in 79. And therefore, they became very powerful. They stayed out of Lebanese politics initially because they said, look, we're here to defend the south because the government of Lebanon can't do it. We're not interested in running the country or taking it over. But they later in the 90s, I think they ran for parliament, and they sensed that they needed to be part of the political process to have wider legitimacy. So they've had members in parliament, member in the cabinet, and they essentially are the kingmakers. So, any major post like the president or whatever cannot be appointed unless they approve it behind the scenes. The important point is they succeeded in their main aim, which is to drive Israel out of Lebanon, out of South Lebanon. Israel tried every trick in the book to maintain permanent control. They occupied it. They tried to set up Israel-friendly groups of people. The South Lebanese army was set up, mainly made of Christians, but others as well. And they tried to create an enclave in South Lebanon that was friendly to Israel and that could protect Israel from other forces. Of course, that didn't work because the majority of people didn't support it, and those people were eventually defeated. So Hezbollah, and when Hezbollah was thrown out of Lebanon, a couple of thousand of these Lebanese who had essentially joined Israel escaped into Israel, and some of them are still there now. So Hezbollah is essentially a resistance movement. Their name, they go by the name is al-Muqawama, which means the resistance. Hamas's name is Al-Haraka al-Muqawama al-Islamiyya, the Islamist resistance movement. So resistance is the critical word in their name. And it's a verb. It's not an adjective. It's not an abstract noun. It's a verb. What they do is resist. And they do it better than anybody else has ever resisted in the Arab region against the two principal foes that they and others have identified, which is an aggressive expansionist Israel and an arrogant, brutal United States. And they have some Arab allies with them, but Israel and the US are seen as the two main threats. And this process has grown over the years from the early 80s to now to become what's called the Axis of Resistance, which is a loosely coordinated group of non-governmental movements, Hamas, Hezbollah, Ansarullah in Yemen, popular mobilization forces in Iraq and Syria, and other smaller groups here and there. They all work together, and they're very closely linked with Iran as very close strategic allies. Iran has been critically important for allowing Hezbollah, now Hamas, and now Ansarullah. You see the progression very clearly in terms of Hezbollah and Hamas and Ansarullah developing technical...
Ansarullah or the Houthis, we call the Houthis, right?
Yeah. And they have developed technical capabilities which are pretty impressive. And they keep getting more impressive, which is one reason why I don't think Israel is going to attack Lebanon. They're going to just keep doing the attacks they're doing now, small scale. But because Hezbollah's abilities to attack deep into Israel and to evade its defense force is pretty impressive. And it's getting better and better. And you see the same thing with Hamas. So Hezbollah has become the most powerful military resistance force against Israel. But they haven't really gone beyond that. They haven't articulated a dynamic strategy to address the political issues with Israel, to coexist one day with Israel, which Hamas has done, by the way. But Hezbollah says, look, we just want to defend ourselves from Israel. We're against the whole Zionist project. We think this is a Palestinian, Arab, Islamic, joint communal property, whatever. And we don't think it should be an exclusively Jewish Zionist state. But they're not calling for the destruction of Israel. Now, some people here and there, especially uninformed American activists, will find a little quote from some Hezbollah writer in 1986 that says, oh, we want to throw the Jews into the sea. And of course, there's a few of those. And you find extremist cases like that. I can spend a few hours and give you 20 quotes from right-wing extremists in the United States saying the same thing about Palestinians or Arabs or Muslims or whatever. So the majority view in Hezbollah is that they're there to defend Lebanon and push back against Israeli and American threats. They've said that once all Lebanese land is liberated, and most of it has, there's a few patches here and there that Israel still occupies, but once all of the problems between Palestine and Israel are resolved, inshallah, hopefully they will be one day, Hezbollah says we'll accept whatever the Palestinians accept. If it's a legitimate Palestinian government, not the laughingstock government that we have now in the Palestinian Authority with Mahmoud Abbas. So that's essentially what Hezbollah is. It's a very, very powerful movement that has achieved a lot, but remains a little bit ambiguous to a lot of people. What does it want in Lebanon? What's its relation with Syria? What's its relations with Iran? How would it coexist with the West? Very interestingly, last week, the Arab League made a statement that they no longer will see Hezbollah as a terrorist group, no longer sanction them, which is fascinating. And I think this is a first step towards movement towards possibly a regional settlement after Gaza ceasefire and other things happen. So there's a lot of ambiguity around Hezbollah, but also a lot of clarity. I would mention one last thing. Hezbollah, like all of these Islamist movements, when they say something, they mean it. When they promise something, they do it. They have very precise statements about their views, their concerns, and their future actions. You know, I jokingly, a non-Orientalist way, I say, well, you know, Hezbollah is more like Swiss than Arabs. They're so precise. When you talk to Hezbollah people, which I have over the years, and Hamas, some of the senior people, and some of the mid-level people, they're so precise in articulating their views. It's really fascinating and important to acknowledge this. These guys are serious, they're disciplined, they have clear principles on which they act, and when they promise something, they do it, and they should be taken seriously. But most of all, they should be engaged because they are the strongest movement in the Arab world, the strongest populist movement, and maybe, if not the strongest, the most effective military movement in the Arab world. So when you see the countries in the Arab Gulf that have spent tens of billions of dollars on fancy American jets and stuff, what they've done was very little. So, the UAE was attacked by the Ansarullah, Saudi Arabia was attacked by missiles, the oil facility, and they did nothing. So Hezbollah acts when it feels threatened, and it's laid out its position pretty clearly. So I think that's the general the key points I'd make.
Yeah, that's very helpful. So one of the things that I hear a lot of people saying is, why is Hezbollah still fighting with Israel, given that Israel left southern Lebanon? Then the implication often is, well, it's because they're not actually, is it because they're fighting in solidarity with the Palestinians, or is it just because, as you often hear in the Jewish community, they're still fighting even though Israel left southern Lebanon because they just want to destroy Israel? So I know that this question of Israel leaving, whether Israel is totally left, is a little more complicated. Maybe you can talk about, but what is the motivation for Hezbollah now, given that the Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon mostly ended?
The occupation hasn't fully ended. There are a few little pieces of land that are contested. Israel still aggresses against Lebanon. Yesterday, they flew jets over Beirut, breaking the sound barrier and scaring people. They attack Lebanon all the time. They've been attacking them regularly now since October, but even before October, they constantly attacked each other. So they haven't left. They've physically moved their forces and their local collaborators mostly out of South Lebanon, but they retain a lot of influence and control over parts of South Lebanon, less than before because of Hezbollah. So if Israel attacks a house in South Lebanon or a Hezbollah unit, the next day, Hezbollah attacks back. And this is what's going on now, except it's escalated a bit because of Gaza. So there's less direct aggression against Lebanon than there used to be because there's more effective response to Israel's aggression by Hezbollah. And this is, the classic Zionist, Israeli, and often American propaganda is, well, they left Gaza, they left South Lebanon, there shouldn't be a problem. Which is not true. But Hezbollah, like all Arabs, is not very good at engaging the world through the media or through mechanisms of public debate, whether it's think tanks or parliaments or academia or whatever it may be. So the Zionist Israeli groups, the United States government, and many others have a pretty much open field. They can say anything they want, like they've done since October. They talk about babies that were burned alive, and 25 people have explored this, including Israelis, and they find no proof of babies being burned alive in October 7th. Other things like that. They say stuff that this hospital in Gaza was used as a command post for Hamas, and they explore it, and it's not true. So the problem we've had over all these years, and I've experienced this my whole life since I got engaged in public kind of action diplomacy over Palestine and Israel. I got started in 1967 when I was in college. The problem is that the Israelis can put out statements that are very dramatic, very bold, sometimes based on truth, most of the time either exaggerated or fabricated, often diversionary. They want to, so the Israelis will say something like, how can we engage with Hezbollah or Hamas? They don't allow women full rights, or they've changed the subject. This is something that's always worked because the Arabs and their supporters in the West have not been able to respond to this kind of aggressive public relations. But by the way, this is a different topic, but all of this has changed now. And the turning point wasn't October 7, it was May, June 21, when we had the Aqsa uprising and all kinds of things were happening. So there's been a significant change that for the first time in the history of the 100 years of the conflict in Palestine between Zionism and Palestinian Arabism, we have now excellent, widespread, coordinated, professional, serious, focused Palestinian action groups supported by allies in the West, whether it's progressive Jews or African Americans or just progressive Americans or whatever, church groups pushing back against this history of wild Zionist extremist propaganda. And law cases are one example. Public debate, street demonstrations, the student encampment movement is the greatest example. And this is now global. This is what scares the daylights out of most Zionists, that there's a global movement now to support Palestine. And it's not, as many people say, this is because people are anti-Semitic or they hate Jews. It's because they love justice. They love freedom. They want the Palestinians and the Israelis to enjoy equal rights in the land of historic Palestine. I diverted a little bit.
Yeah.
But
let me just go back to
linked.
Yeah, so I want to ask a little more about Hezbollah's relationship to the Palestinian cause. If Israel were to say, okay, we will leave every square inch of southern Lebanon, we will not bomb southern Lebanon anymore, we want a truce with you, we want to fight, but leave us alone to do what we want to do with the Palestinians. Would Hezbollah say, okay, because you're no longer threatening Lebanon? Or is Hezbollah partly fighting Israel because of its solidarity with the Palestinian cause? And then how did that influence its response to October 7th and the Gaza war?
The short answer is no. Hezbollah would not say that's okay. They would say, you're carrying out aggressive, criminal, unacceptable, illegal actions against Palestinians in Palestine or other places like the annexation of the Golan Heights and other things. Hezbollah will say, we will continue to resist you and to oppose you in ways that are achievable and acceptable. So Hezbollah won't just unilaterally send a rocket against an Israeli military camp or a school in Israel, because that would be unacceptable internationally. So they would keep working to protect the Palestinians and the Arab region from Israeli, American, and other aggressions. Now, people will debate that, of course, and then you get into the problem of the chicken and the egg. So who came first? What was first? What was the birth of these contested lands and ideas? And of course, that's an important discussion to have. The Israelis don't want to have that discussion. They don't want to talk about Zionism. They don't want to talk about 47, 48. They don't want to talk about the 1915, 1925 period, when the idea of a Jewish state was formalized in international law because of the Balfour Declaration by England in 1917, which promised to support a Jewish home in Palestine, which was then 93% Palestinian owned and inhabited. The Israelis don't want to analyze the full historical context. We insist it has to be. And only by fully analyzing it, which Hezbollah is saying, and others, that we can pinpoint the real points of disagreement and then possibly move towards identifying points of convergence where we might be able to work out a long-term agreement that's fair to both sides, anchored in international law and legitimacy, nonviolent, and validated globally by, say, the Security Council or other means. So that's why Hezbollah is not only fighting for Lebanese land, it's fighting for stopping Israeli-American aggressions against the region. It's a bit like, the US got out of Afghanistan, but it still sanctions them for things like what they do against women, which is not acceptable to most of us. But people said, oh, if the US is going to sanction the Taliban for what they're doing,
right,
and the Taliban are not occupying American lands, well, it's fair enough for people then to be concerned about the actions of other people. So this is a political issue that can only be resolved when people sit down and talk. And this is one of the great shames of the last 30 years, which is that the West has not engaged Hezbollah in the way that they should. In the way that soon, I predict, meaning not in months, but in the coming couple of years, you're going to see Hamas people sitting down negotiating with Americans and others. Just like the Taliban sat and negotiated with the Americans, the Viet Cong negotiated. This is something that's inevitable simply because groups like Hezbollah have something that most Arab systems don't, which is legitimacy. They have real legitimacy. Not everybody in the world agrees with that, but most people in the Arab region agree with that. That Hezbollah, Hamas, other groups that are resisting Israel have a certain legitimacy, and people support them. This is evident in polling and all kinds of other evidence. So really the focus has to be soon on moving to a political engagement rather than sanctions, military attacks, and genocides.
Yeah. So talk about October 7th. Do you think that Hezbollah had any prior knowledge? What do you think Hamas was hoping Hezbollah would do after October 7th? And how do you assess the calculations and the actions that Hezbollah took after October 7th?
Well, this is an issue that's being widely discussed and debated all over the place. I would point you first, for those who are interested in Hamas's actions on October 7th, their intent or why they did it. We just did a series of 5 interviews with really serious scholars on Hamas. This is the Just World Foundation. Helena Cobham started that years ago, and I've recently joined their board. We got 5 really great scholars of Hamas, foreigners, Europeans, Arabs, different people. And there's just a tremendous amount of information in those 5 interviews. They're online.
Where can people find them?
Just World Education Foundation.
Okay.
And it was called, the 5-part was, she and I co-hosted it. It's called Understanding Hamas and Why That Matters. We're not defending Hamas, saying that you should support them. We're saying you need to understand them before you decide to attack them or engage them. It's really worth, and they're going to come out in a book soon. The general consensus among people who know Hamas really well is that they did it because they could not maintain the current situation, which had been going on really since 1947, 48, but it was exacerbated after Israel removed its settlers from Gaza, and I think it was 2005, and then Israel surrounded Gaza and sanctioned it, etc., starved it. They couldn't maintain that. They couldn't allow that to continue. And they see themselves, Hamas, as the only major, there are minor, but the only major Palestinian resistance movement that keeps resisting Israel militarily. And Israel keeps responding with brutal attacks that kill thousands and thousands, leading to now the plausible genocide. So they wanted to basically just disrupt this whole system. I don't think they planned exactly what was going on. You can read articles by various analysts in the West and in the Middle East, which will give you different viewpoints. Some people say this is exactly what they wanted. They wanted to suck the Israelis into a trap, and they did. And Israel is unable to defeat Hamas. It's getting beat up pretty badly in the last couple of weeks. Hamas is unleashing new, more sophisticated weapons, all of which probably reflects the collaboration of the axis of resistance groups and their own skills. But they wanted to essentially end the period of Israeli aggression and Palestinian helplessness. There's no Palestinian government. The Palestinian Authority, the PLO under Mahmoud Abbas, is not a serious institution. It's an old folks retirement club. And this is terrible. It's tragic. It's painful for us Palestinians to see the quality of Palestinian human power, men and women with incredible abilities, sidelined in favor of this old people's club. Nothing wrong with old people. I'm 75 years old, but this old politicians club who simply are not doing anything other than trying to help Israel. And therefore, Hamas had to take the initiative in some way. And this is what they did. They knew that there would be relentless response against them. Always has been in every one of these actions. But they said, look, no country ever liberated itself without paying a price, without a lot of people being killed and injured and disrupted. They know that. And they're not happy that so many people have died. But they also understand that only if Israel and Zionism are engaged in a true resistance process will Israel and Zionism ultimately perhaps respond and shift from the military strategy to a negotiated strategy. And by the way, to that end, which our series talks about a lot, and the book you'll see soon, Hamas has offered 6 or 7 times in the last 15 years to peacefully coexist with Israel in its 67 borders, with certain conditions that are mostly linked to international legitimacy, UN resolutions, etc. So Hamas...
So that would be if there was also refugee return. I mean, the response would be if there's refugee return, and it may be a long-term truce, but it's a truce. It's not a recognition of a legitimacy of Israel within a border. It's just say, we'll have a truce after that.
Now they won't accept the legitimacy of Israel. Mm-hmm. They will accept to live peacefully with it. And they put out these conditions, mm-hmm. and they're all negotiable. They're not ironclad. The Arab mm-hmm. peace plan of 2002 mm-hmm. is a good starting point for that. But the Arab leaderships have remained pretty incompetent at diplomatic engagement. And so Hamas is not leading a political process. It's leading a resistance process.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But it's doing this because there is no political process. Mm-hmm. And therefore, this is what they ended up with. So we'll see. Now, it's fascinating to look at the Israeli government with the collusion of largely pinheaded American officials saying, "Oh, let's do this. Let's create these little clan-based mini camps." And they keep coming up with these extraordinarily nonsensical ideas to avoid having to engage with Hamas, to avoid having to say, "Look, Hamas has support. We don't like the way it uses its arms against us." And by the way, Hamas, as far as I know, has never directly attacked the United States. There may have been something in the past, individuals, but they're focused on Israel, and this is Hezbollah's focus as well, largely. So the logjam of the last 50, 60 years has been shaken and probably broken. What comes next? We don't know. And this is where we have to really hope that the Palestinians, I mean, hope, and also I know that people are working very hard to come up with a mechanism to re-legitimize a new Palestinian government that is credible, representative, democratic, and effective.
Right.
And there's all kinds of ways people are talking about, but we'll hopefully that'll happen. And if there's a legitimate Palestinian leadership, Hamas will be part of that, and they will figure out what are the next steps.
Yeah. On the question of Hezbollah, do you think Hezbollah had prior warning of October 7th? And how do you analyze how it responded? And what do you think Hamas wanted from Hezbollah after October 7th?
You know, nobody really has answers to those questions except the few people who run the military operations of Hamas and Hezbollah. My sense is they probably did not have total prior notice. And I don't think Iran did. I think they couldn't afford letting this leak, even though apparently the Israeli intelligence had some plans and maps and things. But no, I don't think this was coordinated with Hezbollah at all. I think what Hamas hoped for would be dynamic solidarity expressions and practical actions from various people around the region and around the world. They got some of that. Hezbollah agreed to start doing small-scale attacks, essentially trying to divert resources and attention in Israel away from Gaza towards the north to disrupt life in Israel, make life difficult without sparking a full war, because a full war between Hezbollah and Israel would be devastating to both sides. And that's why I'm convinced they're not going to have a full war. It might happen accidentally. Somebody might provoke it from outside. The Israelis keep saying they want a war and they want the US to come in and attack Hezbollah and Iran with Israel. But this is nonsensical. This is a recipe for catastrophe in the whole region, which I don't think is going to happen. So Hezbollah's aim has been to divert as much attention and resources away from Gaza towards the north to make life difficult. I think 60 or 70,000 Israelis have moved away from the north towards other places, and many have moved away from the south, away from the Gaza border. So there's a lot of disruption inside Israel. The economy has suffered. Keeping reservists, they've had 3 call-ups of reservists. All of these things create huge stresses inside Israel, tourism, the economy. So Israel is in a very difficult situation, partly because of what Hezbollah has done to play a role in this process. And Saudullah, Houthis in Yemen have done their bit with attacking ships and stuff. Other people have tried to do some symbolic military actions, but essentially the other people in the axis of resistance are not going to join Hamas in the war right now. It's not out of the question that in the future they might if circumstances change in some way, but all that is speculation.
So if you don't think there is going to be a full-scale war between Israel and Hezbollah, which is a relief to hear, I'm curious how else you think things might proceed. Because the thing one hears from Israelis all the time that I hear is they say, we have to get those people back into the north of our country. We can't have them be living in hotels forever. It's a huge economic, political problem for them, but they can't return until they feel safe. So would it require a ceasefire in Gaza that then Hezbollah would then also be able to come to some agreement with Israel? What do you think is the mechanism that this crisis can be averted?
Oh, it's pretty simple. A permanent ceasefire, exchange of prisoners and hostages, Israel getting out of all of Gaza, and some multilateral diplomatic mechanism that guarantees for Israel and the Palestinians in Gaza. And I would, if I was in the Palestinian government, I'd say an agreement would have to include guaranteeing the security of the Palestinians in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, along with Gaza, that Israel stops all its military aggressions, whether it's settlers or freelance thugs or the government itself, that this has to stop. The Palestinians must be given a respite where they can start rebuilding their societies and economies. And Israel would get the same guarantees that nobody is going to attack Israel. If that happens, which I think can be negotiated, it would freeze the situation now where there's no desire by Israelis or Palestinians to coexist. Obviously, they're in the middle of a war. But once the war ends and normal life can resume, and there's a sense that we're not going to be attacked for no reason, then it opens possibilities for negotiation. But that requires two things. It requires that Zionism, for the first time in its history since the late 1900s, be defined geographically and politically. Zionism has never been defined. So these settlers in the West Bank now can go and do what they want because this is what Zionism does, and God gave them the land, etc., etc. And the world doesn't seem to put any importance in stopping them. So physically, geographically, and in terms of the actions, expanding settlements, etc., expropriating land, those things have to be defined. Zionism has to be defined and confined, contained. Some people say you've got to end Zionism. I don't think that's realistic. If the Jewish people, or many of them, think Zionism is their birthright as a noble heritage from God to have a state where Jewish people can live in peace as Jews, that's perfectly reasonable. But it's not reasonable if that place they choose to do this is stolen from somebody else. So we've accepted, all the Arabs have accepted, coexistence with Israel and the 67 borders. And then you need to deal with the refugees and Jerusalem. These other issues can be negotiated and dealt with. I mean, I've been involved in enough Track 2 meetings over the years, and we've read enough from people who've been in power that we know that if the Israelis make a serious offer of coexistence with a Palestinian state, pulling back the settlements as they did in Sinai and Gaza, if the Israelis say, look, we can live with you, Palestinians, on the basis of the same rights for both of us: sovereignty, statehood, territorial control, and prosperity and equal rights. But it has to be on equal basis. It has to be simultaneous. You know, the stuff we've had in the last 30 years when the US dominated the mediation was basically saying, oh, this is the Dennis Ross, Henry Kissinger school of aggressive diplomacy. It's not really diplomacy, it's whatever, I don't know what we call it. But it says, look, Israel's security has to be guaranteed absolutely and forever. Once that happens, the Palestinians will get good things.
Right, right.
And it's still, we see it now with Blinken, who I can't imagine how this guy got this job. You know, I don't see any of his capabilities, but he says the same thing. They barely say two states, and then they say, we need a horizon, we need this. And there's no affirmative clarity, simultaneity in their approach. And the Israelis and the Americans, the governments, have to come out one day, like the Arabs have done, like Palestinians have done. The Israelis had to say, we will live with a Palestinian state that is sovereign, secure, and free in return for the Arabs living with us with all of those things. We've already given them our pledge to do that. They have to do the same. It's very hard for them because what this requires, you know, when I say defining and containing Zionism, it means that a lot of Jewish people and their supporters in the West have to admit that they've been pursuing a policy supporting the state of Israel and its actions that has been heavily criminal in one respect, criminal meaning anything that's against the law is a crime, so against international law, and certainly totally unfair to come into a land that's 93% Palestinian Arab and say this is going to be my Jewish homeland because some of my Jewish ancestors lived here thousands of years ago. So it's hard for Israelis and Zionists to do that. It's hard for American politicians to do that. But, you know, hard things are what bring permanent peace. South Africa, Northern Ireland, there's other cases. People have to make really hard decisions that implicitly say, we were wrong. We did something that was unacceptable, illegal, cruel. The genocide going on now, that's going to require a whole new set of statements. But this is what genuinely peace-loving, moral people do. And the Jewish people are genuinely peace-loving, moral people. And in the book of Deuteronomy, which I love, and you know, it says that God tells Moses to tell the Hebrews, to tell the world, pursue justice and only justice. So this is something that has to happen down the road. It's not going to happen now. It's not going to happen with the existing leaderships in Palestine, Israel, or the United States. But there can be no military end to this situation, and there can be no end in which Israel and the US tries to test out some new harebrained ideas about setting up local government mechanisms that avoid Hamas, avoid other people, and are run by people that they choose.
What's interesting listening to you is that talking about this two-state solution is when I think most of the time when I listen to Palestinian intellectuals in the West, I mostly hear people arguing that the two-state solution is no longer possible, and that talking about a vision of decolonization, which I think they envision in one political unit, in which there would be a reversal of Zionism, not that Jews would have to leave, but that there would be a kind of decolonization of the Zionist settler colonial enterprise as they see it. And I think there is a fair amount of truth in that. But you still seem to believe that what some might say is the older paradigm of two sovereign states, a Palestinian and presumably Jewish next to it, even though 20% of Israel's citizens are Palestinian, it still remains the better path. So explain to me why you're still of that view.
It's not exactly what I believe. I believe the best solution is one state in which all these people live together. That was the original Palestinian proposal from the 30s and 40s and 50s. It's the Israelis, the Zionists, who wanted to partition Palestine illegally and unfairly. But now, in the situation we're in, having suffered this, whatever it is, 75 years of warfare and terrible suffering, and the stuff you see in Gaza today just makes you cry every time you see it. It's not practical to move to a one-state solution immediately. The global consensus has been for a two-state solution. I see a two-state solution as a transitional phase in which you get the Palestinians finally into a genuinely sovereign, real state, not a make-believe state, and you stop the war. You unleash amazing energies from not just Israel and Palestine, but imagine if you had a true regional peace agreement that was supported and protected and guaranteed by 7 or 8 great powers around the world, and some regional powers. Turkey, Iran should be involved in guaranteeing this, as well as other people. Imagine the power that would be unleashed in economics, in culture, in trade, in water agreements, in science and technology, when you get the Lebanese, the Iranians, the Syrians, the Jordanians, the Palestinians, the Egyptians all working together, because the political divisions have been resolved to a level that is acceptable. If that happens, it's very idealistic, but it's certainly possible. The longer term resolution will eventually, I believe, be a combination of some form that we shouldn't try to impose it. None of us can say, here's what you got to do. But I believe that having spent many years discussing with Israelis and Palestinians and others, that eventually people will coordinate and create mechanisms of either confederation or binational statehood, overlapping statehood. There's many models that have been studied and proposed, but in the end, it's up to the people themselves. But I just want to correct one thing you said, Peter. We're not talking about destroying Zionism. We're talking about containing and defining it in a way that is legitimate in the eyes of international law and in the eyes of the Palestinian people. And we would probably see this as a phase, as not a long permanent thing. But there's things that happen in history that coming up that we can't determine. We don't know. But we know for sure that if they stay as they are now, we're going to have terrible things happening, as they've already started to happen.
We had a question a while ago that I wanted to go back to, and it had to do with what Hezbollah's relationships are like within Lebanon with political leaders and people in the non-Shia population. So what kind of political relationships do they have with Christians, Druze, Sunni Muslims? How much conflict is there? What are these intercommunal relationships like, and in political relationships?
They've evolved over the years. I lived in Lebanon as a child in the late 50s, as a small child. And the only example I can give you from that, which is actually telling to an extent, is we were in Beirut. My dad worked at the UN at UNRWA, and our maid was a Shiite from South Lebanon, because the Shiites did that kind of work. Now, today, you get Filipinos and Sri Lankese, you get people from overseas, but the lowest level of work was done by the Shiites because they were discriminated against. They were not given all the attributes of social economic development. But then I lived again right after college. I went there in the early 70s. And that was the period when you started to have the Musa Sadr, the effervescence of the Shiites in South Lebanon, pushing to end the status of the Shiites as the downtrodden in Lebanon, where the Sunnis and the Christians had much more power. And that process eventually led to, a decade later, in the 80s, the birth of Hezbollah, both for political and military resistance against Israel and the West, and for fighting for equal rights for all Lebanese, Shiites, Muslims, Sunnis, etc. So that process has evolved over there. Once Hezbollah became very strong and was in government, it became a different kind of personality. People had to deal with it. A lot of people opposed it. They still do, and they mock them. They say these are the Persians because they're links with Iran. And many people refuse to talk to Hezbollah. So there's a lot of variations in Lebanese people's attitudes to Hezbollah. But what they've all realized, I believe, is that they have to engage with it in the political system. And Hezbollah has to be very careful to respond to that by engaging with the other Lebanese in a way that's not arrogant and doesn't throw its weight around. Because Hezbollah knows that it has the military power to be able to block any attempt in Lebanon to, say, name a president that it doesn't like or something like that. So this is a really delicate situation. But Hezbollah names, I think, 3 or 4 ministries. They have serious positions at the senior level in security and other things around the country. So they're a major player now, and their challenge is to use their power to try to achieve the equitable development that they say was never done in the past and abuse the Shiites, and to move towards some kind of political resolution of the biggest question that most Lebanese raise when they talk about Hezbollah is, we can't have this group with all this military might outside the arms of the state. In 2006, I was there in the war, and Hezbollah kidnapped some soldiers, and Israel attacked, and a big war happened. The Lebanese suffered terribly. And people say, look, we can't allow this kind of situation to happen. So one of the things that has to happen at some point down the road is Hezbollah's military power has to be integrated into the defense system of the Lebanese government. It's not easy to do. And these are all tough decisions, because if you look around the region, whether it's Palestine, Israel, Lebanon, Yemen, Sudan, Syria, you look all over the region, Libya, all these states that have fallen apart or are rickety states or full of guns and violence and lack of any law and order, it's because the question of modern statehood in the Arab world, which really emerged after World War I in a big way, that question was never resolved in any Arab country. And I say this carefully, but I'm willing to bet a double shawarma with hot sauce on this, that no Arab country has resolved the question of its own statehood on the basis of the legitimacy of the citizenship. And therefore, all the Arab states, with no exception, have pretty much failed the triple tests of citizenship, statehood, and sovereignty. Some have done better than others, but none of them have fully resolved these 3 issues: statehood, citizenship, and sovereignty. And it's because not a single Arab country, except briefly Tunisia in 2013-14, then the old guard came back, not a single Arab country has ever allowed its citizenry to validate statehood and government and ideology and policies. We have never had a self-validating Arab state. And this is the problem we see. So you see in Lebanon, you see in Syria, you see in Palestine, everywhere, it's the same thing. If you had states where the citizens truly were engaged in a legitimate process of debating their differences, the Tunisians set a terrific example right after their uprising in 2011-12. They've spent 1.5 years, 2 years debating constitutional law, this and that, minorities, the role of Islam, role of women, whatever you want. They spent years doing this and came up with a constitution that they all agreed upon. But then some conservative Arab countries and others didn't like it, and they pushed for the overthrow of that system, and we're now back to the old military government system. But this is something that the Arabs have to resolve on their own. I mean, the Arab region is the only region in the entire world that is non-democratic, the only one. There isn't a single credible democracy in the Arab countries. You have elections, you have courts, you have political parties, but none of them are really, really serious. And the Arab people in 210, 213, 14 made a very strong expression of they're fed up with being treated like people with no rights. So the Arab nationals and the Arab citizens who thought they were coming into real serious statehood between 1930 and 1970, say, realized by the 1990s that they were not citizens, they were consumers. Their only right was to consume. So you go into Arab countries and you find 35 different kinds of fried chicken shops or car dealerships or whatever. And this is the great pain that causes people in all Arab countries to worry about their future. They're not revolutionary people, but most citizens are dissatisfied. In the Gulf, small, rich countries, you have less of this. They have plenty of money, small populations. Some of them are really well run in terms of material development. So if you look at Qatar, Kuwait, UAE, they've done a good job of building schools and hospitals and this and that. But underneath the surface, throughout every Arab country, even if you're materially well off, there are discontented people because their full humanity has not been affirmed in effective citizenship. So that's a pretty tall order, I know. But this is something that the Arabs have to deal with themselves. And one of the problems is that we still have a lot of external intervention in these issues. And one of the reasons, by the way, that the Arab region is like it is, non-democratic, is because it's the only place, as far as I know, I'm not a historian, but I think this is accurate. It's the only place in the world as a region where foreign military intervention has gone on for almost 2.5 centuries. Since Napoleon, we've had nonstop foreign military intervention in our lands, not just coming in and threatening, but shooting and killing and this and that. And it's increasing. So, we've had the Turks, the Iranians coming in, the Israelis have done this for a long time, and then the Russians, the Americans, the British, and Yemen, and whatever. So it's crazy that.
And also internally, right? The UAE intervening in Libya or in
Well,
Sudan.
this is then Sudan. They're competing now in the Horn of Africa,
Yeah.
but direct military intervention is nonstop.
Yeah. We're just about out of time. Rami, this was extremely educational. Thank you very, very much for doing it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Next week, we're going to be Friday at 11 a.m. again with Jim Zogby of the DNC talking about whether there's a way to replace Biden. Who knows where things will be by next Friday. But Rami, thank you. Really appreciate this. Have a great weekend, everyone.
Go Yankees.